Welcome back, and to those who just joined us, I'm Jamie Fly, the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative, and we're moving into the afternoon here at our 2012 forum, The Price of Greatness, the Next 4 Years of U.S. Foreign Policy. We're very honored to have a lunchtime conversation with Senator Joe Lieberman, which is going to be moderated by Senator Kelly Ayotte from New Hampshire, who in her almost 2 years now in the Senate has really begun to emerge as a real leader on national security issues. So I'm going to turn it over to them in a minute. Before I do that, though, I just remind everyone, including people watching this at home on C-SPAN, you can follow the Foreign Policy Initiative at Foreign Policy I on Twitter. And we're also going to be collecting some questions from Twitter if you use the hashtag FPI Forum that we'll try to use for the rest of the forum today. So with that, I'll invite Senator Ayotte and Senator Lieberman to come up to the stage, and I'll turn it over to Senator Ayotte to start our lunchtime discussion.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks, Jamie. See you.
Appreciate it. Well, good afternoon. It's great to be here with all of you. And most of all, it's an honor to be here with my colleague, Joe Lieberman. And I'm pleased to moderate today's luncheon session entitled Reflections and Projections, the Past and Future of Foreign Policy in the Senate. And this will be, I think, a great conversation with Senator Lieberman. And as you know, he's serving his 4th term in the United States Senate, and unfortunately will be leaving us soon. And we'll feel a grave loss in the U.S. Senate with his background on foreign policy, the work that he has done to make sure, obviously, as the chairman of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, to make sure that America is protected. I've had the privilege of serving with him on the Armed Services Committee. He is also chairman of the Airline Subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee and serves on the Personnel and Sea Power Committees. And he has, for me, it's very special to be here today because we are assigned mentors in the Senate. And we're typically assigned bipartisan mentors, and he has been mine in the 2 years that I've served. And also before he served as in the United States Senate, where we all know the accomplishments that he has had, the independence that he has shown, the courage he has shown in making sure that America is protected. He has been one of the strongest voices for national security and for the role of America around the world. But before that, he was also an excellent Attorney General of the state of Connecticut. And I had the privilege of serving as Attorney General, so I know that experience really he brought to the Senate. And so today, let me just begin the discussion by saying that I will take 30 minutes and I'll ask Senator Lieberman questions and Joe questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor to all of you to ask what questions that you have for Senator Lieberman. Joe, you have been in the Senate for nearly a quarter of a century. Let me just start with this. Where do you think, in looking back at that time, do you see the most important successes of the United States in the world, and where do you see have been our greatest failures? Can you help us, from your perspective, where we've gotten it right and where we've gotten it wrong?
I'd be glad to. Let me first say what a pleasure it is to be here and give express my admiration to the Foreign Policy Initiative for what it does, to state it as directly as I can, to both educate and engage people here in Washington in foreign policy and more broadly in the importance of America's role in the world. So I'm glad to be here at FPI. Glad to be with Kelly Ayotte. Every time she says I'm her mentor, there's some old line about I was so-and-so's student, she taught me a lot. I'm sorry, I was so-and-so's teacher, she taught me a lot. And that's the way I feel about Kelly. It may be risky to say this in this audience, I don't think it should be, that the only previous senator who asked me to be his mentor when he came into the Senate in 2004 was Barack Obama. So Kelly's future is really unlimited, I would say. That's my track record, and Okay, so this has been, I've been privileged to be a senator from Connecticut now for 24 years, and it's been a remarkable 24 years in the world. Think about the changes. Beginning in the year I arrived here in '89 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the collapse of the Soviet Union and the spread of freedom throughout Eastern and Central Europe, we know enough now to know that it hasn't all worked out exactly as we hoped, but it's a lot better than the former Soviet Union. So I guess I'd say generally, the best thing I could say, that to me, the best things that have happened over this period of time has been the spread of freedom throughout the world. As an absolute value, that's good, but it's also consistent with our founding national values expressed in the Declaration of Independence. There are many more countries today that are both free in the sense of democratic governments and that have more or less market economies than did before. I think it's important to say that a lot of this would not have happened without the presence of the United States, an active presence, proactive presence of the U.S. in the world, including the U.S. military, which has been a guarantor of stability. That's a precondition for prosperity and a precondition for all the movements toward freedom. So I'd say that that's probably the most significant thing that's happened. The fall of the Soviet Union, the spread of freedom through countries in Asia, the Arab Spring, though its course is at this moment undetermined. So that's the best news. And all of this has been good for us, not just in some, not just because these changes reflect our values, but the changes in so many countries toward market economies and prosperity have also benefited our economy. I mean, hundreds of millions of people have come out of poverty in Asia alone, and our commercial interactions with them has been very good for us. So, what are some of the failures? My wife, if she were here, would tell me I have a reflex tendency to block bad news. So you see, I'm having a hard time. This is probably a male characteristic. I'm sure all the women here would agree. Look, I'm focused on things that are a bit closer. Look, some of the challenges that we've had. Perhaps I'd say that we very often have come to the right. Remember the Churchill line, America always does the right thing after it exhausts every other option. It's not quite literally true, but when you think about some of the great challenges that have occurred in the 25 years. So the Soviet Union collapses, and pretty soon thereafter, as a response to the absence of this central autocratic authority in the region, there's war in the Balkans and genocide, in fact, in that case of Muslims. The Europeans were very slow to respond, even though there was a real test of the stability in their part of the world in that period of time. We were slow. I was privileged to work, and this is how I really began my relationship, my friendship with John McCain, with John, with Bob Dole, and with Joe Biden. An interesting bipartisan group. I was still a Democrat then. That's what it wasn't tripartisan. And but it was when we finally got involved, we did it right. We ended the genocide, but a lot of people were killed, and stability was restored there. So I'd say, more recently, well, right now, look, there's a perplexing situation in Syria. We have been much too slow to get involved. The situation gets worse and more complicated. And the other thing I would say is that this is really more about American public opinion. I've been thinking about this. The kinds of wars we're facing now, the kinds of challenges to security, to freedom, are so unconventional that they don't end quickly. The enemy is unconventional. And it's very hard to sustain public patience until you've really succeeded in your goals. And I'm thinking here particularly of Iraq and now of Afghanistan. Of course, our goal was to get to a point where we could withdraw our troops, but we should have found a way to have had an agreement with the Iraqis to keep some small contingent group there to protect their stability and to protect our interests and to dissuade the Iranians from taking over. And this is but the public was impatient, became politically appealing to basically say we got all our troops out of there. So those are challenges that I will leave to you. I leave the Senate, incidentally, very grateful that I had these 24 years. I'm sure there'll be times something will happen and I'll miss being there, but I feel very good that people like Kelly Ayotte are there because she's really a genuine internationalist and cares deeply about the strength of America's defense, and that's really important.
Thank you. You raised the issue of Syria. We know that 38,000 people have been killed. We have the violence spilling into other countries. There's been a rise of al-Qaeda gaining some strength there. What should we be doing in Syria? And what type of American involvement should we have there? And as you leave the Senate, what would you like to see us do there?
Well, to me, we've missed a real opportunity there, and really we've failed to act consistent with our own, not only our own interests, but our own values. I mean, the values, again, this is a brutal dictatorial government slaughtering its own people so that it can stay in power. That's Bashar Assad. But the second is that the most significant threat the United States, and I'd say the world faces today, is from Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Everybody knows Assad is Iran's #1 ally in the Arab world, in the region, probably in the world. This natural uprising of the Syrian people is an extension of the Arab Spring, of our values. Frankly, it should have been a no-brainer from the beginning that if Assad goes down, it's bad for Syria and it's good for us. Incidentally, the people looking at this from Tehran get this, because they've been in Syria from the beginning with equipment, with weapons, with personnel, with everything. And the problem here is that, John McCain and I went over there real early. We met not into Syria, but we got pretty close. We met with refugees and people who came out to meet us from the Free Syrian Army, and both in Turkey and in Lebanon. And early on, in my way of thinking, these people were Syrian patriots. They were not Islamist extremists or terrorists, but we let them hang out there too long, and now increasingly you've got extremist elements coming in, offering them more than we are, Al-Qaeda-related elements. So that we can still act. We should have been for almost all the 18 months been giving them weapons to defend themselves. They don't want our troops on the ground. We don't want our troops on the ground, but they want weapons, including anti-aircraft equipment that can knock down the Syrian planes that are brutalizing them now. There are other ways. I don't know. Some of us have called for a no-fly zone in an area probably in northern Syria that can be in Syria what eastern Libya was for the opposition to Gaddafi, a kind of base. The Pentagon has said, and they're not all wrong by any means, that imposing a no-fly zone would require knocking out the Syrian air defenses, and that's tough, would take a long time. But there are other ways to do this if we really want to. You could knock out we and other nations that have actually been ahead of us in this fight, France and Britain, to name two, and of course Arab allies like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Turkey. We could knock out most of the Syrian Air Force on the ground. probably with missiles fired from vessels offshore. Patriots are apparently, at Turkey's request, are going to go to Turkey to protect them from the Syrians. But Patriot anti-missile systems can also be used to knock down planes with a range of 25 to 50 miles. We could set up Patriot batteries on the Turkish border with Syria and on the Jordanian border with Syria and effectively create no-fly zones. So, look, this is going... I've met with enough of these dissidents, freedom fighters in Syria. They're not going to give up. And the question is how this ends. And there's a danger here that Assad could draw into Damascus with a sort of Iranian-supported enclave, Alawite. Then there could be chaos in other parts of the country, which would have a kind of civil war between some of the original freedom fighters and the al-Qaeda-related people. And it'll be a mess, and not what this should end up as. So, again, the sooner we get in there with real help, there's anger now toward us, and there should be, by the dissidents. And the sooner that we get in there, the better chance we're going to have to try to have this end in a good way.
Well, you've clearly talked about that we should have gotten involved sooner. But I also hear you saying that we still need to be involved in the outcome in Syria. And also, presuming Assad does go down, which is, I think, what everyone's hope, and we've heard the administration say expectation, that we have a relationship and can help form what happens afterwards. Which brings me to thinking about the challenges that we face right now with the Arab Spring. When we look across what's happened with the Arab Spring, where do you see us right now with the challenges we face? Particularly, I look at what just happened recently in Egypt,
right,
with Morsi. What would your advice be to the president who, no question in his second term, faces a very challenging posture around the world? We talked about Syria. We talked about the threat from Iran, which is a very troubling threat, not only to Israel, but to our country.
Correct.
In terms of their continued march toward acquiring the capability of having a nuclear weapon, but also in our dealings with Egypt, with the recent conflict between Hamas and Israel. This is a challenging time, as it always is, to serve as president. And what type of advice would you give the president looking forward at these challenges?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that the U.S. has to stay engaged in the Middle East as fully, if not more fully, than we have been up until this time. And the reason I'd say that first, and I think the administration gets this, is that all the talk about pivot or rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region, of course the Asia-Pacific region is important. It's very important economically. And it potentially could be a real danger zone strategically, and depending on how China acts in the years ahead. But really, you can't disengage or even lower our engagement level. I know that one of the things that the administration has been planning is to move more of our Navy assets to the Asia-Pacific out of the Persian Gulf, the Middle East generally, the waters around North Africa. We can't do that. It's another reason, as you and I feel strongly, you can't cut back the size of the Navy. And Bob Gates said something like, no matter how great the American military is, the less money they have, the fewer things they can buy, the less we can ask them to do. Well, so it was really quite telling, I think, that the President goes off quite appropriately to Asia-Pacific for the meeting, the regional meeting in Cambodia, and he's on the phone most of the time outside of the meetings to the Middle East because of what's happening in Gaza. And the reality is that not only is the Middle East continuing as an important area to us economically, the greatest threats to our security in the short term certainly will come, greater threats will come from there than Asia. So I'd say nobody should, in the White House, should be under any illusions. I don't believe they are, but it's important to say that we can in any way disengage from the Middle East. The second to say is that the Arab Spring is really at once both an extraordinary opportunity and really full of risk for the future. I mean, it's a classic moment. You know, I think any of us could probably imagine futures for the Middle East 10 years from now that are each of which is plausible, and yet they're dramatically different. I mean, one future is that these revolutions, which were meant to achieve freedom and economic opportunity and tolerance, really end up back to totalitarian governments that may have a more religious, a more Islamist content to them, but they're totalitarian nonetheless. And you can imagine Iran with a nuclear weapon. I mean, it's a very unsettling picture in every way for us. On the other hand, you can imagine that this is worked out and Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons, and that in the countries that have experienced the Arab Spring, yes, we have competing religious groups and secular groups, but they actually hold elections and they go back and forth. How this goes is indeterminate now, and I would say that the best thing we can do is to stay engaged and really to, I'll be real quick about this. I mean, essentially don't demonize the new governments unless their behavior justifies it. And don't romanticize the new governments in the Arab countries unless, well, don't romanticize them anyway, but judge them by their behavior. I mean, there are some Islamist governments that are more hopeful. Take the name Tunisia. The government in Egypt is heading in a troubling course. And part of this is to be prepared to speak the truth to these new powers. And look, even though President Morsi apparently played a very important role in reconciling or ending this crisis in Gaza, it's no excuse for the U.S. to be at all hesitant to say to him, you can't expect normal relations with the United States if you suspend judicial review. I mean, if you essentially make yourself the government. It's too inconsistent with our values. It's not going to, the president could say it's just not, no matter what I think, Mr. President Morsi, those folks in Congress are not going to accept this. The other thing I'd say that probably we haven't done enough, you know, when McCain and I went to Tunisia and Egypt right after the Arab Spring, and we met with the leaders of the revolutions, particularly in Egypt, I think we were both fascinated by the fact that their goals here were as much economic as they were political. Of course they wanted freedom, but these were revolutions that were, a lot of them by, I just heard somebody else at a program I was at earlier today describe them as the middle class poor. These are children of the middle class, well educated, couldn't find a job, staying at home, feeling that the powers that ruled were taking all the money, which they were taking most of it, and so their revolutions were about economic opportunity, all of which is to say that, you know, one of the things that's worked in Asia to take hundreds of millions of people out of poverty is free trade. And I think one of the things may help with all the other conditions we've talked about in the new Arab world is more free trade agreements with them, between them and us.
As you're leaving the Senate, and you think about relatively new members like me, new senators coming in, and the institution itself, and the important role that the Senate plays in foreign policy, what is it that you worry most about in terms of, as you leave, your legacy in the Senate, but also thinking about the Senate's role in foreign policy?
Well, this will not surprise you, Kelly. So I worry about two things, at least. I mean, one, obviously, is the growing partisanship around foreign policy. And this is not shockingly new. It's just been more pervasive. It's one of the reasons why I've so enjoyed working with McCain and Graham and people like you, others in the Republican Party, because, you know, the old Vandenberg-Truman alliance after the war against the Soviets bipartisan is really important. The whole idea that partisanship should end at the nation's shores. Of course, we'll have differences of opinion, but they shouldn't be partisan. So I worry about that. The other thing I worry about in the Senate is that there are probably a lot of senators, maybe including you, whose staffs tell them, why are you spending so much time on foreign policy? This is not what the people at home care about. But I guess if you're not doing anything else, then probably you're taking a political risk. I mean, in other words, if the people don't know you care about how they're doing at home, then, but I know that in your case, they know that you do care about that. So what I'm saying is, first, the first responsibility of the federal government, the unique responsibility, is to provide for the common defense, to maintain our freedom and security. And you can't do that unless you're involved in foreign policy and matters of defense. You have an obligation. I also think that, truthfully, crises occur, most of them unexpected. Most of the things that happened that were really big in my 24 years, fall of the Soviet Union, 9/11, Arab Spring, nobody was predicting those. And when they happen, people at home really want to feel that they're represented by people who have had some familiarity with the world. I know that there was a point where members of Congress were afraid to travel because they thought their constituents didn't want them to travel. I've traveled a lot because I feel, how can I make a judgment about what's happening in the Middle East or Asia if I haven't been there to talk to people? So that's why there's a core of people newer in the Senate in both parties who are committed to this, and may you never lose that commitment and grow in strength. And I think ultimately your constituents will appreciate that.
Thank you.
As long as you're also taking care of the potholes at home.
Take care of the potholes, right. Absolutely.
Right.
Everyone who runs for office knows that's responsibility number one. But you're absolutely right. I think one of the challenging issues that we face as newer members, as you leave the Senate, your legacy, the important role you've played on foreign policy. I think of others like Senator Kyle, Senator Lugar, who have had a similar dedication to foreign policy, making sure that America remains strong and that we have a predominant role in the world. This issue of how we communicate with our constituents and make sure they understand why foreign policy matters, I think is a very important legacy of yours that as a newer member of the Senate, I feel a responsibility for. Because I think we all could have the experience, I can tell you as a senator, of going to a town hall and walking into that town hall and saying, I'm not going to give one more dime to another foreign country, and I'd get a standing ovation.
Right.
But we know that would be irresponsible in terms of America's role in the world, in terms of making sure that our country is protected. And I really appreciate the role that you have played over the years in explaining to people in a way, and in the way that you've conducted yourself at home and around the world, of showing the importance of American leadership around the world.
Thanks, Kelly. Maybe I'll just add another word, just sort of a thought as I leave, and this will be no surprise. Over a period, the two extremes, probably more extreme than is real, but isolationism, internationalism have gone through our history, and they've gone through both of the major political parties. But there is a real strong bipartisan tradition in foreign policy that, to me, in my lifetime, has been exemplified on the Democratic side by presidents like Truman and Kennedy, who was my inspiration into public life, and Clinton for a lot of what he did. And on the Republican side, well, certainly by Eisenhower, Nixon, and most impressively and memorably by President Reagan. My worry now, and I'll now have a partisan concern, that I'm worried about there not being enough people in the Democratic Party who embrace that Truman, Kennedy, Clinton position on foreign policy, which is the heritage of the party and really in the national interest. And so I hope. Sometimes people say to me, well, why have you worked, Democrats, why have you worked so much with the Republicans on foreign policy? I said, well, because I agree. We agree with each other. So I'm not gonna not work with them because they happen to have an R next to their name and I had a D or now an I. So that's something I worry about. Really, there needs to be strong internationalist, hopefully majorities in both political parties for the betterment of our country. And right now, I think that's it's not clear where the Democratic Party is going in that sense.
Well, before we leave for audience questions, I'd like to ask you, you've done so much for the country in the nearly 25 years you've served in the Senate. You've done so much for the world. When you reflect on your career, what are you most proud of?
Oh, that's very... I wish you were on television. I could do your show. You know, I just have had great opportunities. Look, I've tried to be true to what I see as the really founding, driving American principle of freedom, the Declaration of Independence. Self-evident truth that all of us are created equal and endowed by our Creator with those rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that those are universal human rights, and it's our mission to try to spread them. And to the extent that I've been able to support dissidents and freedom fighters around the world, affirmatively, that's what I feel best about. You and I, together with John McCain, I guess Lindsay was there too, visited, we were in Asia earlier this year, and we visited Myanmar. We met with Aung San Suu Kyi, a great hero who we've all tried hard to support. Thrilling to see her there, see the president of Myanmar talk positively about her. But then we met with these three dissidents who had just been freed from years in prison. And they were, I mean, this is a long way from the Soviet Gulag, but a lot of us have read Sharansky and how, really, in some sense, almost saved he was. But when he heard that President Reagan had declared the evil empire, and that Scoop Jackson had been involved in the Jackson-Vanik proposal. So it's a long way from that to Burma, Myanmar. But these three dissidents said exactly the same thing. What you folks in the Senate say about this is critically important to us. And of course, they had a particular bond with John McCain because they knew he had been in prison as well. So I feel really good about that. I suppose more defensively, by the twist of fate, that I ended up as the ranking member or chair of what was then the Governmental Affairs Committee. I had the opportunity after 9/11 to be at the center of the creation of a lot of the reorganization and reform that followed 9/11 to try to protect our homeland, including the Department of Homeland Security, the reform of the intelligence community. All of it really together, the most significant reforms of those areas of our government since the 40s, appropriately, because there too we were suddenly facing a different enemy, which is the Soviet Union after 9/11, obviously confronting the reality that violent Islamist extremism, terrorism, had declared war on us. So I feel, you know, fortunate that I had the opportunity to do that. So that there's the affirmative and the defensive. Thanks for asking.
No, thank you so much for everything you've done. And I have to say, that was an experience for me, as in traveling with you and Senator McCain and others. It's quite an experience when you meet with a dissident. And I took sitting in that meeting and realizing the things that you have said in standing up for freedom and human rights for individuals around the world, they hear it, their governments hear it, and it matters. It very much mattered. I mean, the dissidents that we met with, you could tell, you could see the tears in their eyes, you could see the feeling, the years that they spent imprisoned, that someone in this country like Joe Lieberman or John McCain would stand up for them and stand up for their freedom and their rights, made a big difference for them under those difficult circumstances. So Your legacy has been tremendous in terms of the impact you've had on freedom and human rights. And so we appreciate everything that you've done for our country. And obviously, going forward, hope very much that whatever the future holds for you, that you will remain very engaged on these issues, because we need your advice. We certainly need your strong voice on these issues to make sure America remains safe.
That is certainly my intention.
And now we'd love to open it up to all of you for questions. I'm not sure how this works, if I can just call on people and, sure.
Well, you bring up Burma, and it reminds me that about 2 months after Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were invited to join NATO, I sat down with Adam Michnik, who had been in prison, as you remember, as you may know, for a long time. And I said, okay, we've gotten you all into NATO. What's next? And he looked at me and he said, Burma. So I went to Burma. And two things. I'm very concerned about the speed with which we have jumped so happily into having an ambassador and all of these wonderful things we have done, and notwithstanding the fact that some of the prisoners are free. And I wonder what it was that caused the administration to go against Aung San Suu Kyi's advice not to have the president visit. And I am also concerned about how we stand for human rights, and yet so strongly support Nazarbayev. How do we stand in front for that, but then back down when there are natural resources that are attractive to us?
Yeah.
How do you handle it?
So this is a classic dilemma and a test of us, of our country. Which we live, to put it mildly, in an imperfect world, and therefore the best of public servants or administrations rarely are perfect in their application of our principles to everything we do, but in the world. But we're always on stronger ground, not just in terms of fidelity to our founding principles of freedom, but really in the long run, in terms of our success, if we're, to the extent that we're more true to our values than to what somebody may argue are our interests at the moment. So that would be my formula. And that's why I said earlier, look, I think now, it's interesting what you say about Burma. I also, and I think the president got this message, wondered about why the president was going to Myanmar, Burma. As you know, when he went there, he went out of his way to say this is not an embrace of everything happening. This is an encouragement to continue. This is the reality. And this, of course, is what we have to do, just to come back to the earlier question in the Middle East as well. We got to judge people by their behavior. We have to, that's one of the ways in which we can influence their behavior. So we have to hold people to standards, and these are like dials, and we have to, but always the dial for human rights has to be turned higher than the dial of our interest, and that's true in Myanmar as well. The change has been really remarkable, but it's really just the beginning, and she becomes, Aung San Suu Kyi becomes a good compass for us, really, that we should follow. She's no more perfect than anybody else. She's an extraordinary person, however, and has shown just courage that and principle that entitles her to our respect and our ears when she speaks.
Yeah, it's truly inspirational to meet her too, particularly to be at her home with her where we went when we traveled. And we're also getting questions from Twitter, so we want to make sure we take one of those. And one of the questions is very direct, says, Senator Lieberman, what is the biggest foreign policy concern you have in the next 45 days?
Okay.
I wanted to hear this too, so.
Yeah, this is interesting. So next 45 days. Well, I think I'd still have to go with Iran and the nuclear weapons program. I mean, I think that's the, of all the things that are happening here, what happens to the Arab Spring, what happens in Gaza, Israelis and Palestinians, what happens elsewhere in the world, that this is really the big challenge to world stability and world peace. Because if they really, and you know, it's possible, it's not likely, but it's possible within 45 days. From everything we know, not only from our intelligence, but from the International Atomic Energy Agency about what the Iranians are doing, there could be a breakout at any time here where they'd break out and go forward. So that remains my biggest concern. Syria could begin to see a change just in the direction I've talked about, which doesn't end, as people have assumed, with the collapse of and departure of Assad, but it ends with him controlling a small Alawite part of the country with a lot of resources, a lot of chemical weapons and all the rest. And then the rest of the country divided among the other groups, particularly the majority Sunnis, and a real civil war going on between the extremists and the, what I'd call the nationalists, the Syrian nationalists. So that could happen in the next 45 days, and that would be really destabilizing for the region. But to me, Iran is the big threat.
Why don't we take another question from the audience? Yes. Sure. Yes, sure.
Senator Lieberman, I'm hoping that you can maybe provide me with a little bit of optimism, because I'm feeling a little bit maybe cynical. Over the past 10 years, I think we've had a really tough time in doing things like restoring political order in states or helping restoring stability, rebuilding security forces. Arguably, I mean, I know there's a difference of opinion in this room, but I would say that Libya, you know, over the past year, we've seen, instead of a strong security sector, the devolution into militia groups that are now more complicated. And I think arguably we're not very good at that we have very weak non-military instruments of power. So why should we be more optimistic that we'll be better at doing this in Syria? And the risk is, if we're not, we're creating a vacuum of power there that the Iranians will quickly and deftly exploit, just as arguably they're poised to do in Afghanistan and Iraq they've been active in.
Right.
So is there reason to believe in today's political climate, and given the deficit and the financial situation, and given Americans' tiredness with foreign policy, as you both have discussed, that we'll do any better in Syria? I mean, I would hope that we would, but...
Yeah. So that was supposed to elicit an optimistic answer?
Yeah, well, just in the sense, do you, from where you sit, do you see a sense that we could possibly do better?
Yeah, I do. Now, as I said earlier, the fact that we and others in the rest of the world have laid back from the conflict has made it much more difficult. The last time we were in Turkey, and we met with some of the Syrian army leaders who had come out to meet with us, one of them said, really got angry that we hadn't been helping them, and he said, you're putting us in a position where a lot of our young men are turning toward the extremists, the al-Qaeda-related groups, because they're offering more than we are to them. So that's the sense in which it makes it harder. But if we get, the sooner we get in, the better we'll be positioned to, I mean, this is, we know from, I use a homely analogy, but we know from our own political lives that you tend to remember the people who helped you when you were in a fight, and remember those who didn't help you. I'm thinking of a much tamer fight, a political fight. It's obviously true when you're fighting for your life and your freedom. You know, perhaps I can be more optimistic about Libya. And to respond to your call in this sense. First, interestingly, Libya is the case. And now, you know, question of whether we were involved enough, but we were involved. Our allies, France, played a very important proactive role in Libya. So we're pretty popular in Libya. So it was interesting that, and people have a sense of gratitude, just what I said. We stuck with them during the fight. But interestingly, in their elections, the, I'd say really secular people were elected. Perhaps you'd say moderate Islamists. Fascinating thing is that some of the leaders of the secular forces sort of held on to their own more secular, moderate view of the Koran. They didn't let the Islamists sort of capture it. But so that's good news and hopeful from very high-quality people there. They have an actual democracy functioning now. I mean, opposition, government parties, and all the rest. But here's the other thing. I hope from all the swirl around the tragedy in Benghazi on 9/11/12, one thing that should jump out at us is, and here's the patience problem again. It's over. Gaddafi's gone. Goodbye. We really should have stayed in there and given them, and we should go back in now, not with troops, but with people who can help them build up their security forces and bring them under the government instead of having a series of militias controlling for security purposes different parts of the country. And we should be able to do that. Some of our allies, again, I talk about France, I think would be willing to join us in partnership there. This is an eminently salvageable situation, but look, what happened in Benghazi is the result of the fact that, ironically, after this revolution, overthrow of the dictator, Gaddafi, election of a secular government, Eastern Libya became a lawless land, open country, and foreign fighters and radical militias all receded there. Painfully ironic, because that was the center of the revolution against Gaddafi, but all those people, or not all of them, but a lot of them have moved to Tripoli, to the government. So this is salvageable if we use our brains and a little money.
But it makes the case for continued American engagement there.
It does, and we'll pay for it if we don't. I mean, one of the other lessons of history, short statement, there's always there's the siren call of isolationism, but in the end, we pay for it. We either pay for it with a greater cost in terms of trying to restore security, and we almost always pay for it economically because of the way in which our prosperity is so tied to prosperity in the rest of the world.
Well, we can't ignore our folks on Twitter, so I'm going to do one more Twitter and then turn it over to you. But this is an important question because you've worked very closely on these issues. Many believe that, and I'm adding this to this question, but many believe that the next attack on our country, really when we think about what happened to our country on 9/11, could be a cyber attack, and that there's grave concern about protecting our country against a cyber attack. And what the Twitter question is this, is a cyber attack a declaration of war? How do we resolve the attribution problem in cyberspace? But I also think that it's a really important question overall in terms of where you see the potential for a cyber attack, what our country obviously needs to do more to make sure that we're prepared for that, but certainly your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, the truth is we're under cyber attack every day. It's both, we've been lucky so far that it hasn't really caused greatly destabilizing consequences to our society because the attackers haven't really tried to knock out parts of our cyber system yet. I'll come back to that in a minute. But one thing they are doing is stealing. They're both organized criminal gangs are moving millions, probably billions of dollars of money, stealing it out of accounts in cyberspace. But even more consequentially, they are stealing. It's probably government-sponsored and undoubtedly coming mostly from China and Russia. They're stealing our industry's trade secrets, and with that, saving themselves billions of dollars, and incidentally taking an awful lot of jobs from the U.S. So, but there have been some significant attacks. I mean, just a while ago, these happen, and then they pass, and people forget about them. But there was this sustained attack on a big number of big banks in our country, Bank of America, Wells Fargo. It's just within the last month or 6 weeks. Probably you read the stories. It was not a sophisticated attack, but it was a denial of service where they sort of overload the systems. And for a period of time, those big banks had trouble connecting with people who, their customers, to put it broadly. Aramco, the Saudi energy company, had 30,000 computers wiped clear of their data. Incidentally, what appeared in place of the data they had was a picture or video of a burning American flag. So you get an idea on those 30,000 computers. You get an idea where that came from, probably from Iran. I guess that so did the denial of service attack on our banks. So this is the classic in asymmetrical warfare. And we just got to work together. I mean, I don't want to talk about the bill that we thought we had a compromise on. It didn't make it. But the next Congress really has to make it a priority to make sure that the public and private sectors are working together in a way that protects our nation, because this is a real danger. It'll be almost irresistible, and that's why countries like Iran are investing a lot of money in this to not take us on where we're strong militarily, but just think about what you could do to this country. Think about what happened in New Jersey, Long Island, other places after Hurricane Sandy. Power's out for a week, week and a half, 2 weeks. I mean, it's possible to have a cyber attack on the electric grid that knocks out large parts of the grid around this country for, let me just say, a long time before it gets restored. And we got to raise our defenses to that. I will say to you, now this is more optimistic, that our offensive cyber capacities are quite developed. So we're ready to do battle in this arena if we have to. The other thing to say, and it's too long a topic to get into, when a cyber attack becomes an act of war, it's going to be hard to define. I know there's some attempt in the administration to do that. I think you got to leave it to the president, to Congress, et cetera. But quite remarkably, and we've become so sophisticated at this. Not so long ago, one of the great fears about this unconventional form of warfare is that we could be attacked and not know who was attacking us. But because it's, it goes from country A to country B to C to D, and then we get attacked. But it really wasn't country D. It was A that started this chain in cyberspace. We've now developed, I think, some really impressive capacity to track back attackers, let me put it that way, so that they will not be immune to counterattack. And we have that capacity, and as so often happens, it's not pretty, but in matters of war, a threat of war, there's no substitute for strength and the capacity to inflict more pain on your enemies than they can inflict on you if you have to. And I think we've developed that capacity in our government, fortunately.
Thank you. I think we'll take one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up.
That's as optimistic as I get. We're no.
We appreciate that.
Sorry.
Right?
You have one over here.
Very much. Senator, phase 2, consolidation of democracy. If we look back at the last recent wave of democratization, Eastern Europe, certainly they've made great progress toward democracy, rule of law, joined the EU, joined NATO. However, recently they raised concern also over what's democracy in those countries. Hungary, for example, has raised concern over the concentration of power into the hand of the Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Last summer, Romania went through a political struggle, potentially disrupting. State Department issued a statement on rule of law and the importance of democratic institution. How do you see the role of America to support these countries, especially relevant now with the Arab Spring revolutions? If you look at Eastern Europe, for example, again, USAID, State Department, all withdrew, and we know the importance of these programs to support civil society, for example. Question number 2, the role of NATO. Some see the NATO as a workable toolbox available to solve conflicts way beyond its borders. Some possibly in Europe, wonder and cautious about expanding beyond its original mandate and scope. How do you see as a workable tool possibly to solve more conflict way beyond its border in the future? Thank you.
Sure. So for some reason, your first question takes me back to that famous story about Benjamin Franklin coming out of the Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia, and somebody in the crowd asks him, what do we have? What form of government do we have? And he says a republic. It's easier to say. Most people understand democracy better. But a republic if we can keep it. And that's always the case. Some of the countries that came out from the former Soviet Union are doing really well, democratic market economies. Others have slipped back. That's part of the peril of democracy, really. And this is exactly the challenge that is happening now in the Middle East. This is not new. I mean, we know that revolutions in the name of freedom often don't stay free. The most powerful example of that, obviously, is the Russian Revolution of the last century. Our revolution, fortunately, is the one that's really, for all of our occasional back and forth, has remained the most resilient. Maybe I'd say the French Revolution has done pretty well, too, over history, notwithstanding what is it John Locke said? What do you think of the French Revolution? He said it's too soon to say. No, I think we can say that. So what do? It goes back to what I said earlier. We have to use. This is the spectrum of values and interests, but values always have to have more weight, and we have to use whatever clout we have economically, in terms of granting credibility, trade, etc., to hold countries to a standard, and not to go about business as usual, either in Eastern Europe or in the Middle East, if countries go off the track. And the second point, NATO always was mostly seen, and it probably was mostly, an alliance against the Soviet Union, to protect particularly against the Warsaw Pact countries moving west. But it also had a powerful internal European function, and U.S., which was to unite the long warring countries of Europe into a common alliance to hold them together, and it really overall worked remarkably well in that way. And I think that's why it was so important, notwithstanding some of their slips backward, to engage the countries of Eastern and Central Europe when they passed the test in NATO. So a lot of people thought, well, if the main purpose of the alliance, which was the Soviet Union, is no more. Here in parentheses, they say, keep your eye on Putin's Russia, just to, about whether there's a threat there. But if that threat is there no more, then it would dissipate. It hasn't so far, and it's stretched out far beyond NATO's home territory in a very constructive way. Very important to us to make sure we're not the only country assuming this burden of global leadership, and so I think it continues to be important. Look, the real challenge for the NATO countries now, for all of us, is fiscal, and because so many of them are cutting their defense budgets. They've had lower defense budgets than they should anyway. You compare the defense spending in Europe to that in here, but particularly in the Asia Pacific, where not only in China, but now increasingly in the countries around China that are worried about China doubling, going down in Europe. That's not a good sign, not helpful to us. And that's why we have to solve our fiscal problems here and not solve them on the back of our national defense. We've got to go to really the drivers of and it's not easy, but it's the entitlements that are really the biggest drivers of the deficit at this point, and we've got to deal with those and then hopefully make a grand bargain to raise some more revenue, and that'll enable us to invest in our defense and protect our security and our freedom. And I might say that I'm optimistic that we're going to do that. I guess I'd end also saying, perhaps the obvious to everybody in this room, and I have such a clarity about this at the end of these 24 years. I mean, this is too easy to say. There's nowhere else I'd rather be in the world than in the U.S. And I mean that not just in terms of freedom, and also, for me, gratitude for the unbelievable opportunities I've been given in this country, but also economically. I mean, you compare our economy to the problems of the European Union, the problems of China, and look at our history for continuing really cutting-edge innovation that's global, whatever all the Apple products and Facebook and everything else. The real problem here is the government. Honestly, if we solve our fiscal problem in the government, I think it's going to stimulate an incredible wave of private sector investment. People have been sitting on trillions of dollars because they're worried about our future, worried about what the tax structure will be. And I think I would bet, and this is not just chauvinism or patriotism, that America will remain the dominant power in the world, economically, militarily, culturally, in terms of our values, for as far as the eye can see. And it will be particularly so because Kelly Ayotte will be in the U.S. Senate.
Joe, thank you. Thank you.